Welcome to Upstream. I'm Shane Morris, here with another edition of Further Upstream. My colleague, my friend Tim Padgett joins me once more to talk more about my recent conversation on the podcast. This time it was with Glen Scrivener. He is an author, speaker, apologist, and filmmaker who I encountered a few years ago on YouTube, as I said, through his spoken word poetry. And if you haven't seen that, you really need to go check it out. He's just amazingly talented in that area. But he has ventured into this realm of, writing about history from an apologetic angle. And he's produced this marvelous book. It's called The Air We Breathe, How We All Came to Believe in Freedom, Kindness, Progress, and Equality. And Tim, this touches on your area of academic training, which is, of course, history. You talk a lot about church history. You know a lot about church history. And this is sort of something that's always fascinated you. So I'm excited to dig further into this and just talk about the broad argument that he's making in this book, because it's a familiar one, but he makes it in a new and I think more pithy way than it has been made before.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, pithy is a good word for it. I just remember listening to your conversation, and it just seemed like you guys were just sitting at a coffee shop or at a pub having a great conversation about stuff, and it just seemed like a delightful amount of fun to have. He does definitely have a way with words and saying things clearly and well. Definitely something that you and I, who deal with words a lot and ideas a lot, can envy to some degree his ability in that. But yeah, I mean, it is a fascinating thesis. I mean, it's one that Christians in one sense have been making for thousands of years. Actually, the breakpoints, we had a fun little coincidence where your podcast with him went live on Tuesday or whatever it was. I guess it was on Tuesday, and then we also had a breakpoint in both of so he got mentioned in two Colson Center things on the same day. Because I cited him with him and Tom Holland, in one sense, echoing Augustine of Hippo's classic argument. And that was that, the pagan world comes to the church and, blames the church for all these problems, all these disasters, moral failings, and all this kind of stuff. And Augustine's argument 1,600 years ago was that, for one thing, the world without Christianity is nothing to write home about. It's a pretty messed up world. The brutality of the world without Christianity is very evident. And that was an argument that Augustine made, and that's an argument that Scrivener makes as well. And that the brutality of the world without Christ. But then also many of the things that we see of as good, as valuable, these didn't come from nowhere. These came from Christianity. They don't come from someplace else. And it's a fascinating argument to make because it's very compelling, even as in the same time it's very unexpected. I think we see that in so many ways. I mean, I think we probably all have lots of friends who are, atheists or agnostics or whatnot. And for them, truths like justice and mercy and forgiveness, these are, as you guys said in the conversation, echoing Jefferson, these are self-evident truths. I had this one friend several years ago. Actually, I would love to have a conversation with you and him. Last I heard, he works at the Atlanta Aquarium, marine biologist kind of guy, and just sci-fi fan, great conversationalist, but an absolute atheist. He knows Christianity, but he just doesn't believe it. And I remember in many late night coffee house conversations, there was this coffee house in Alabama where I was living at the time where it was open 24/7, and we were having conversations about philosophy at 2 a.m, which you do when you're 21 and 22. I would say that you can't have morality without Christianity. And his response was, well, of course you can, because we have it. And it was to him, well, it's obvious that it's true that morality is good and that justice is good because we have it. It's self-evident. But he couldn't see that you simply don't get morality. You don't get the sort of world that we live in without Christianity coming first and giving us those concepts.
This is the kind of meta critique that Scrivener brings to bear. And it's a very effective one, especially coming from a Christian, someone who's not just sort of observing this like a Tom Holland would, somewhat skeptically, questioningly about the whole thing, but just being honest. This is coming from a Christian who really believes this stuff and is calling someone up into a further and deeper investigation of the truth of where their moral convictions comes from. And I call it a meta critique because it's not sort of the classical, here are 6 reasons why God exists and why you should take Christianity and the Bible seriously, sort of apologetic. It is you already believe apologetic, where he said, you are already a believer. You already have deeply held convictions about metaphysical and ethical truths and assertions that simply cannot be proven or even investigated through the natural sciences or through empirical experimentation. These are things that live in the realm of ideas, the realm of ethical reflection, a realm that you, by virtue of, being a secular person, say really doesn't exist. It's not made of atoms, it's not made of atoms or energy. This is ethical truths are something that you have to presuppose in order to make these kinds of claims, though. And secular people do make these kinds of claims. And that's the power of the argument, that we do believe as a society, whether secular or Christian, deeply in the ideals of equality and freedom and progress and enlightenment and all of the other, and consent and all of the other principles that he goes through. The question is, you already believe. You already have these metaphysical commitments. Where do they come from? And on what do you base them? He talks about how you have this beautiful ethical castle that's hanging in midair. And the reason we know that these things just don't exist on their own, they're not self-evident, is through a simple historical comparison of our culture with other cultures. And that's where Tom Holland obviously shone. But I think that there is a huge group of people, Tim, that I would never give Tom Holland's book to for several reasons. One being that it's just too academic, and another that it's written from an unbelieving perspective. And I would give this book to those people just because it's, less academic and because it's written by a Christian. And I think they would have to honestly admit, based on whatever they believe, based on the historical proof, that Christian values, the values we think of as given, but that we just swim in or breathe or whatever your metaphor, these are not historically inevitable, nor are they historically popular. They are the minority report by far in history. And we, as enlightened modern Westerners who believe that all men are created equal and so forth, need to give an account of why that's true. Because as he said, if Plato and some of the ancient philosophers were sitting next to us at a dinner party and we said, oh, human equality is self-evidently true, right? Human rights are self-evidently true. They'd say, respectfully, I don't see where you get these things. Where do they come from? And I think most secular minds would have a hard time producing an answer.
Yeah, I mean, I do find it fascinating that so much of the critique of Christianity is that the church has made things bad. Well, let's say Christianity has made things bad. Not merely Christians, but Christianity itself is evil. And they need to strip that away, almost as though, actually, you and I both love sci-fi things, and there's the sci-fi trope of, Christianity is stifled science. I was actually watching one sci-fi show recently, and it was talking about like a parallel culture that had developed off in space somewhere of another human society. And it said that, there was this 800-year period in the Dark Ages where science and learning were considered heresy and anathema. And it's so commonly shared that everybody believes it. It's one of those everybody knows ideas. But if you actually do the history, that simply isn't so. The church wasn't the group out there stifling learning. They were the ones preserving. As the Roman Empire was collapsing and the Vikings were coming in, they were the ones collecting these things. They were the ones holding on to it. And they kind of have this idealized view of the pagan world. But you go back to my ancestors in Northern Europe, they were a brutal bunch. Glenn Sunshine likes to talk about every once in a while the story of the Athenians were coming up to this one island group, island city in the Greek world. And they said, well, this is not right for you to do. And the Athenians' response was, it is for the weak to obey and the strong to conquer, or something to that effect. And that was normal. And you look at the Greco-Roman world, just the brutality, which you guys hinted at to a significant degree about the sexual immorality. What we would call sexual immorality, but for them simply wasn't. It was just right. It was your right as a man because you were stronger. And so you took what you wanted to take. And you think about the way that sexual ethics have developed within Christianity, that for a free man to have sex with his slaves, male or female, was not considered adultery. It's not because they had these loosey-goosey ideas of 1960s style sexuality that it wasn't anything wrong with adultery. They definitely thought there was something wrong with adultery. You just couldn't do so with another free person. A slave wasn't fully a person. And the idea that everyone from the emperor down to the slave was an equal human being, that's something you get from Christianity. You don't get from the pagan world. Or you look at even before the Roman era, the beginnings of Western stuff, like Mesopotamian world, the pagan myths, they're awful. I mean, it's all about power. It's all about obsession, and there's the constant conflict and repression.
You know, Tim, when you read a book, you often develop a picture in your mind, a sort of image of the person the author is writing to. And Glenn definitely divides that up into three. You know, he talks about the nuns, the duns, and the ones, W-O-N, and nuns being N-O-N-E. We're familiar with that category. It's just those who profess no religion. And then the duns are like, I'm done with Christianity. I don't want anything to do with it. And then the ones are, well, us, Christians, who need to be better informed about where our values come from and how powerful this sort of apologetic is. But I felt like despite this tripartite sort of audience division, I did feel like there was a stronger emphasis on the duns, on the ones who just said, you know, I not only am I not a Christian, but I could never be one because I am done with Christianity and with the church. I dislike or morally disapprove or even despise this institution we call the Christian church. And he invites those people to really press into their reasoning, to the reasons why they're done. And he asks them, what is it about the church that you have found so morally off-putting? What is your objection? And almost always, you know, I like to work over at Starbucks a lot because, well, number one, it's the closest coffee shop to me. And number two, because I have 4 kids and this place can get pretty loud. So I go and sit down there at Starbucks and just sort of enjoy the white noise. And I'll glance up at the employees from time to time. And you know how they have those little caps with like the bills and the spot for all the buttons, and they put kind of flair on it like an Office Space. Well, you know, half of them have these little rainbow flag flare pins, and we all know what that means. I support, you know, LGBTQ equality and people. Probably means this person has a friend or two that she looks at and says, I want you to live a full and happy life and so forth. And I think you're equal to everyone. And I imagine in my head as I'm reading this, that she's probably done with the church, right? She probably doesn't like the fact the church is so judgmental and exclusive and doesn't let people be who they are and doesn't believe in the equality of everyone to love who want to love and be with who they want to be with and be who they are, right? And I think Scrivener would talk to someone like that employee at Starbucks and say, well, hang on a second. Why is it that you're done with the church? Is it because of that they're mistreating, you know, your gay friends, that you perceive that as mistreatment, you know, the moral standards of the church? Well, why do you hold those moral standards and the beliefs that you do in, you know, the equality of everyone and the importance of affirming the dignity of individuals and love and all of this stuff? These aren't values that you can derive from history. Certainly not. We just kind of gave the overview of that. You could read a dozen different books about exactly how fraught the ancient world was. There may have been plenty of homosexuality, but there was also plenty of exploitation and no belief that, you know, whatever your sexual proclivities, you're just as good as anyone else. That's not how it works. The powerful rule. So this idea of equality and the other values by which this person is critiquing the Christian church and saying, I'm done with it, is actually a Christian value brought in. And that's what I mean by meta critique. It's like your objections to Christianity show just how Christian you really are. Not in the sort of spiritual sense that we would often use in-house, meaning you have allegiance to Christ, you're redeemed, you're washed by the blood, that sort of thing. We mean that you're culturally Christian, you're morally Christian. You have absorbed values that you're now turning around, and using against the church. Or let's say there's someone who has abandoned the church because of the sexual abuse scandals and so forth, the cover-ups and the exploitation of the weak. Well, you know, that's a very good reason to be mad at the church. Very good reason, because not only are they, you know, committing a moral wrong, but they're those who've done so are hypocrites because of what they preach. But who exactly are you running to bolster your condemnation of the church? You know, the Romans aren't going to help you. The Greeks aren't going to help you. Our secular culture, you may think they'll help you, but the problem is they have no idea why they believe what they do. They think we're just mischievous apes, right? And it turns out You know what mischievous apes don't do? Respect each other's consent and sexual dignity. They don't. So those questions hang out there, and I have a very hard time, Tim, imagining how the Starbucks employee, or even a more sophisticated, like someone at a grad student at some university who's very secular and done with the church, but very moralistic, how he or she would answer the points he raises.
Yeah, I think it's great. At first it kind of threw me, his use of the term believers for secular people. And he's trying to convince them that they're believers because, of course, we want to protect it. We don't want to be syncretistic, but that's not what he's getting at all. It's almost like he's saying, you guys are Christians in the closet, that you're closeted Christians, which is a fun term to use in this context, but that they really are driven by, they're trying to pretend that they're not driven by Christian values, but they really are. They're in denial about how much of the Christianity, how much of their understanding of the world. And again, as you say, even their critiques of Christianity are rooted in Christianity. I remember, if you think about, like, Francis Schaeffer used to talk about the Christian consensus. By that, he meant that for a long time, Western civilization was significantly Christian in so many ways, in the sense of people being believers. And then people kind of stopped doing that, but people continued to act as Christians for a long time. Now, in his analysis, which I think is correct in many ways, it's a little different than what Scrivener's getting at here. It's that as the Christian consensus falls away, it becomes evident, things become worse and worse across society. And what we see here is that consensus is continuing, even by people who are rejecting Christianity. Not merely that they thought of it's not like people 100 years ago who would have thought of themselves as Christians, but they're not genuine believers. They just kind of go with the flow. The people even now who are antagonistic to Christianity, they too are holding on to the truths of Christianity. And I think it was a podcast you did with Tom Holland a couple of years ago. I think you came up with a conversation with the protesters and the Handmaid's Tale outfits, and how that he commented how so much of their critique of Christian patriarchy, as they would have thought of it, was rooted in Christian ideas. That the idea that you shouldn't, like you said, that you shouldn't oppress women. You don't get that from paganism. You don't get that from naturalism. Again, you watch, if any of us watches, as sort of animal documentaries, the male lion doesn't really ask permission. The animals, they kill. There is a harshness to the natural world in that sense. If you go solely with naturalism, you get brutality. You get conquest of the weak by the strong. I've seen enough documentaries, the ones where the lion goes in and takes over another pride, and what's the first thing he does? Well, he runs off the other male lion, and then he kills the cubs. And we have to look at that and we say, that's not exact. If we saw that in a human situation, that would be horrible. That would be horrible brutality.
Yeah. That's one thing I always run to when we have this conversation, and this is just an aside, but one objection you'll sort of hear from atheists who think they're somewhat clever is, oh, well, morality just evolved. It just evolved that way. So it's altruism is a group behavior that's advantageous for our survival and so forth. And I say, okay, well, let's grant that in our species instance, altruism has evolved for the sake of survival. Let's grant that. We're evolving. We can change. We were once something completely different, and in the future we'll be something completely different from what we are now. If we happen to evolve in the direction of the big cats, one of whose signature behaviors is this pride stealing and then killing of all the previous male's cubs, right? If we evolve in that direction, does that behavior then become right? A man taking a bunch of, a group of women and then killing all the previous man's offspring. Is that okay morally if we evolve in that direction? And they'll never say yes, because they know that there's something transcendent that's above and beyond whatever biological development happens that judges that situation in the case of humans and says, no, you can't do that. And it'll never be right, no matter what course evolution takes. And that's just sort of the response I give to them. But, that's an aside.
Well, hopefully not getting into Godwin's law here. But I had a friend who, atheistic guy as well, or agnostic, I would say. And he was fully into moral relativity, that morality and ethics, they are sociologically derived. They're just whoever wins gets to determine. He was a thoroughgoing postmodernist in this sense. But I asked him at one point, it's like, so if Hitler had won, would he have been right? And I remember his face was like contorting, but he said, yes. which is very unusual because I know nobody wants to say that, but you would have thought somebody had just killed his puppy because he was struggling. He knew that there was something deeper than that.
Well, it wasn't an Aryan puppy, see?
Yeah, exactly. Yes, a little blonde, golden retriever there. But I think that's the beauty of arguments like this. In one sense, the arguments in this book are similar to Paul at Athens, because we've read Anselm, we've read Aquinas, we've read some of these great arguments for the existence of God, like you mentioned earlier. And while they're true, they can be a little clinical, a little cold-blooded sometimes, because they're put up in like formulaic language and things like that. You have to have a volitional element to embrace them. What you see with this book, and you see with Paul at Athens, is he's saying, I'm not telling you that you need to believe what I believe. I'm telling you, you already believe what I believe, and I'm going to tell you why. So Paul is saying, you already worship this unknown God. Let me tell you about him. And we see in this book, the author is saying, you already believe in justice, in mercy, in self-sacrifice as being absolute goods, that these are self-evident goods. Let me tell you why you believe that. And I think that's a much stronger argument than, the ontological argument by Anselm or something like that, as true as it might be or as weird as it might be.
So, Tim, help me out with this. This was one thing that I wanted to get to in my discussion with Glenn, and I didn't have a chance. And I kind of gestured toward it at the end, but I think it's worth further discussion, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. So we live in a time when we look around us as Christians and we say, this culture is opposed to Christianity. This culture is anti-Christian, right? Some people will even say this culture is like a pagan culture. And if we get stuck in our own little historical moment, we might be tempted to believe that there's never been a culture this opposed to the things of God. Well, a little historical investigation will disabuse you of that notion, but I think it is right to look around us and say, yes, this culture has turned against Christianity in some key ways, and that hostility isn't just sentimental. It is actually an ideological hostility to Christianity and to Christian doctrines and values and virtues. And so, we may look at our secular neighbors and they may say, oh, I'm motivated to believe in LGBTQ ideology because of compassion or my belief in equality. But the problem is that actually, fundamentally contradicts one of the Christian beliefs about the world and marriage and sex and how we were designed. And so that compassion has run amok. It has sort of become cancerous and now is eating at the body that we say it belongs in as Christians. So my question is, how do you deal with rotten Christianity? I mean, Scrivener is very clear that his message is not the culture is so Christian, guys, that you should just be like the culture and the culture should be like us. And we're all kumbaya. It's not the case that the culture is like us anymore. It is absolutely the case that there's strong opposition there. So how do we understand Christian values divorced from Christianity? And where do those go in the long term? And then I guess the last part of the question is, how do we confront that?
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, it gets to a lot of his core question. I think it explains a lot of what's going on. I mean, you look at the passion of the world. We look at the fact that our world is increasingly intolerant. The irony of that a world that says there's no such thing as truth, that there's no such thing as morality, yet has become increasingly absolutist, has become increasingly intolerant of any divergent view in a world that claims there's relativism. And I think it's because we have, I think you in your conversation hinted at, we have held on to the claimed virtues of Christianity, of justice, of compassion, of there being a truth for all humanity. But we've rejected any root for it. We've rejected any basis for it. And so it's like literally a loose canon. You might say it's a loose epistemological canon, and a loose moral canon, that the people know there's something wrong with killing people, with oppressing people. They know that's so, but they don't have any place to give them perspective, to give them a security, any rock to build upon there. And so they get the passion without the certainty. And I think that is what is driving so much of the contemporary world, how there's such a passion for justice. They know that there's something wrong, but they don't believe that there's any reason to believe that something's wrong. Instead of making them more tolerant, it causes them to double down. It double down on the intensity, because only by the feeling of a passion of working for justice can they have a sense of sanity. I think this is what comes through when we see the rhetorical conversations about political conversations and social conversations is because they've rejected the idea of God, but they insist on the idea of justice. And so they must fill their lives with causes, little causes that aren't built. They aren't designed for the weight that we put on them. These little gods, little causes that we've elevated to the height. And I think that politics becomes a key point in this because politics claims to speak for justice, to speak for identity, to speak for mercy, and all these sorts of things. But there's not enough. It's an Ecclesiastes moment where we're trying to live for these things that aren't strong enough to bear the moral, epistemological weight that we're putting on them.
Well, let me repeat the last part there because I think it's worth digging into. And that was the question of how we engage with that moral fervor that is essentially Christian in its DNA, but has run amok and is now actually eating up the Christian heritage out of which it emerges. How do you sort of, handing them this book, how would you make that the case to someone about that? And then I have another sort of more ominous question after that, which I did ask Glen, but I want to hear your take as well.
Well, again, to quote Francis Schaeffer, he spoke of the church as being the pilot plant of the kingdom. Or you might think of, to borrow from, Lenin, that the church is the vanguard of the kingdom. That one of the most potent things we can do is live out our lives in accordance with the truth. We need to have that truth. I don't mean the supposed St. Francis thing of, preach always, but, if necessary, use words. I don't mean that. There's a place for words, absolutely. But it must come with, if we live our lives in light of what we believe to be true, if it is true, then you'll see human flourishing. I think that one of the reasons that we see an antagonism in many parts of the West against the West is because the West was so powerful, is so powerful. The West was able to conquer the world. 500 years ago, 600 years ago, the West was barely anything. And then with ocean-going vessels and guns and stuff like that, they had the power to impose their will. Their fallenness was able to exploit the rest of the world. But where did the power come from? Significant portions of their power came because they were living significantly in light of the truth about what it meant to be a human being. So the human creativity was able to explode. The human senses of justice were able to expand. And all these wonderful things came from living in light of the truth, but then because of our fallen nature, it exploited things. So if we live in light of the truth, we can demonstrate to the world a better way of living. So this means reading these books and knowing these things and thinking these thoughts, but it also means living in light of it. It means living in a way that our neighbors have to ask, why are they different? Why are the divorce rates among Christians better than the world? Why is it that hospitals come from Christians? Why is it that orphanages come from Christians? That we need to demonstrate by word and deed the truth of what we live.
It's funny because the first Christians seem to have been drawn in by this character of Jesus and then adopted his radical and non-self-evident values. But it seems like we're in a position of having to run the opposite play on people where we say, you're convinced believers in these values of Jesus. Let me introduce you to the person from whom they come and the only person through whom they can emerge into the world, right? Because the world is not like this by default. I wonder if there's another reversal too, where instead of pointing to the goodness of Christ all the time, we have to point to the badness of humanity, to the default state into which humanity falls and has fallen throughout history without this radical intervention that we call Christianity. And to me, and this leads into my last question, because this is one that I do think about a lot. And Tom Holland got this into my head and got it haunting me. But, his line, and Glen repeats this to some extent, is you can only go on living off the fumes of Christianity for so long. You can only go on asserting values without the Savior who introduced them for so long. There's no Lord behind them, right? Eventually, someone is going to call your bluff. Eventually, you're going to say, wait, you don't believe in human equality and you think certain people should be exterminated from society? What are you, some kind of fascist? And somebody's going to say, well, yes. What of it? What's the big deal with that? And at that point, the secular, social justice warrior has nothing left to say. What do you think about the possibility that secular society is either ripe or ripening for a resurgence of pagan morality, that at some point that pagan sensibility that the strong should win and own the world will rise back up, and with the memory of Hitler and the Nazis sufficiently far in the past that people will begin to embrace it en masse again. What do you think about that?
Well, it's a scary thought for sure, but I don't think it's an untenable thought. I think we do see some of these things already. I mean, you see the rise of crime across the West in so many areas, just the violence, the brutality that seems to be going on. I mean, there has been a decrease in violent crime since the 1990s, and that has been a great thing. We aren't at the inner city crime that we had back in the 70s and even into the 80s. There has been a decrease in that sense, but there's a wantonness to some of the crimes that you see. The people who go and smash things up, and you ask them why, and said, well, why not? We would talk about the 1970s crimes, the 1980s crimes, as bad as it was, they recognize it as theft. Whereas people now, it's almost like they don't recognize it as theft. Like, I wanted it, so I took it.
Another thing has happened too, just focusing on those crime stories, Tim, is that I didn't know until very recently that mass shootings, the kind of nihilistic mass shootings, especially of schools and things like that, are a new phenomenon. That's not something that has a long history. It actually kind of began in the 90s and has become a regular drumbeat ever since.
Yeah, there's that nihilistic element. There were in the past bank robberies. We think of the Prohibition era and the gangsters and all that kind of stuff. There was a violence in it and a horribleness to it. But it's this world-destroying, self-destroying crimes that you see in these shootings. Just up the road from here in Denver area, so many, the Aurora shooting, that theater, the Littleton, I think it was Littleton, the first famous one at a high school. And so much of that comes through. I think we see that domestically. I think we also see it internationally as what we used to consider international norms. I mean, think about it. For 80 years, the great powers have been at peace, which is very unusual on a historical scale. There has not been a great power war since 1945. But we see now when people like Russia invades Ukraine, when China threatens Taiwan, what do people say? It's a breaking of international norms. And it's almost like, why not? Why shouldn't the Russians move into Ukraine? The current contemporary culture does not really have an answer for that, why they shouldn't. And there is a brutality to what's going on. And you hear, I mean, I don't know if you've seen on Twitter or whatever, there's all these comments that these Russian soldiers make about the Ukrainians. Said, oh, they're less than human. Of course we're going to do this. And that the idea that the Chinese can simply move into Taiwan and take it over because they want to. There is this breaking of this consensus. And it's kind of this Christian/Enlightenment consensus that even though all throughout this time, people are hypocritical. People broke the consensus, but there was at least the idea of a consensus. There was the idea that you shouldn't go invade your neighbors willy-nilly. That when Hitler invaded, lots of people who weren't Christians said this is wrong. And they might not have had a good reason to say that it was wrong, but that they thought it was wrong. And the terrors. I think that his example of that Hitler in World War II had become our new cultural, civilizational story. That we used to, what would Jesus do? And now we say, what would Hitler not do? What did Hitler do? Let's do the opposite. I think that's really keen and I think that as we were repulsed by Hitler, he's become this cartoonish figure. He was evil, wretchedly evil, but he's become this, cipher that we can place. It is the moral evil that we oppose. And anyone, I mean, how many times in conversations does, well, you're being such a Nazi? I mean, why are the Russians moving into Ukraine? By their word, to fight the Nazis. Why do we oppose them? Because they're acting like the Nazis. I think there's something to that. But if that fades, we don't have much of an answer as a culture as to why not act like the Nazis. As a culture, as the church, as Christians, we definitely have an answer as to why not to do that. And what we can do again is to live out. We can show the world a better way. We can show them that justice and mercy, they're not illusory. They're not imaginary. These are part of the God who is love, the God who went from heaven and came to earth, self-sacrifice. This is a real part of the universe. I think that is our best chance, but we do have to step up now.
I wonder if there's an aspect of scaring our secular neighbors straight that we could sort of employ here. In many ways, this book is sort of a scared straight approach. It's like you believe in things, and God bless you for believing in things. I share many of those values. That seems to be Glen's approach. But why do you believe them? And what are you going to do the first time someone comes along and says, you know what, I don't believe these values that you hold. In fact, I'm with the majority of mankind throughout history. I believe the powerful should triumph and they should have whatever they want from the weak, from the conquered. And there's nothing at all wrong with that. In fact, according to your evolutionary science, that's just the way that nature works. And we are just, mischievous apes. And so there's no reason we should behave otherwise. Change my mind, enlightened secular Westerner. And there's nothing left to say at that point. And making people realize, opening their eyes, taking them upstream into the sources of the values that they cherish and hold dear, and that they even, prosecute Christianity with, is a valuable undertaking. It's helping people to realize the depth of what it means. Well, first of all, the depth of what Jesus did for Western civilization and humanity by inculcating values that are super countercultural historically, but then also the depth of the darkness into which we are plunging if we really do want to get rid of Jesus, if we really do want to excise him from the moral universe and from our spirituality and say, he has no claim on us. If Jesus is not Lord, someone else is going to be. And the point I think Glen Scrivener is making is that it's going to be whoever is most powerful. Or do you really want a world like that? If not, maybe it's time to take a second look at Jesus and really be serious about it this time instead of just, unselfconsciously judgmental.
Yeah, if you just look at postmodernism and critical theories and things like that, they're intensely judgmental and they intensely reject any sort of ultimate truth, absolute truth. What you end up with then is power. Power is all that matters. I mean, that's even postmodernism is explicit about this, that there is no ultimate truth. It's just whatever the community happens to think is true and right. Who has the power makes the rules. It's the iron, instead of the golden rule, it's the iron rule. And I think that so many people, when they reject Christianity and they reject contemporary, the tradition of the West, that they think they're going to be liberated into a place of justice and mercy and things like that. But what they're left with is this pagan world where truth, justice, mercy are irrelevant. Who has the power? Who can employ the power well? And they even reject any attempt to analyze them. And I think that we can, I think that you're right about scared straight. We can show, is this really where you want to go? Or let us show you a better way? And I think that that's our hope.
Well, Tim, that was a great discussion. Thanks for joining me again. Thanks also for taking the time to just, read this book and give me your thoughts on it. I asked you beforehand to kind of take a look at it, and you did that. It felt like you read it in like 3 hours. So thank you for that. And I really enjoyed this conversation. Looking forward to next week.
Sure. Always a pleasure to talk about this or any other subject.